Hey there, friends. Welcome to Curiosity Bridge. My name is Alex Noel. This podcast is built on the idea that there's an opportunity for connection in each and every person. That connection, that bridge, is something that we cross through curiosity. In high school, I, like many people in our area, had to take a class called Career and Life Skills, aka COM. It's a requirement for graduation, and it contains 3 sections. Number 1, personal health. Number 2, finances. And number 3, employment. Honestly, I remember next to nothing about personal health, except we had a few very interesting guest speakers, and we had to watch the quote-unquote documentary known as Super Size Me. I kind of remember the finance section, but not nearly as well as I should have. And with the benefit of hindsight, I'm thankful to my teacher for at least trying to teach me, someone so young, perhaps too young to try and internalize it, things about savings accounts and credit cards and taxes and all that kind of stuff. What I do remember is the employment section, in particular something called a career aptitude test. My resume was heavily weighted towards childcare because I'd done a ton of volunteer work with kids in various places, from summer camps to community centers and things like that. My grades, however, were bad, and for the most part, my ambitions were mostly just be alive and don't cause too much trouble for other people when you're older. When it came to the career aptitude test, you'd fill out the grades that you've achieved so far, you put in some of your life goals, put in your resume, and what it's supposed to do is spit out 3 options, directions for you to consider going after high school. Now, my number 1 of 3 options was taxi driver. Reading through the description, I summarized it in my head at least as, you can be a taxi driver because it doesn't involve any post-secondary and your grades are bad. Option number 2 was stuntman, because that was cool and exciting, but it also didn't involve any post-secondary education and my grades were bad. And then option number 3, perhaps the most surprising, was nothing. I had no option 3. It just couldn't come up with something else for me to do. I remember after that class having a meeting with the school's career counselor to try and figure out what I was supposed to do, and the verdict was that there wasn't a whole lot for somebody like me. My options were either get better at everything, anything really, or just sort of give up and do something like taxi driving or stunt driving that didn't really sound personally fulfilling, but fits my skill set at the time. Now, what I didn't really understand at that time is that in high school, it doesn't mean that your whole life has to be decided in that moment. We talk about the end of high school like this is it, this is the gateway, this is your pathway, and you're not allowed to change it. In reality, a whole lot has happened, and my students know this by now, but I've worked a lot of different jobs in my life trying to figure out what worked best for me. And among all of that kind of stuff, not just the money to live, which was essential, not really a resume boost because people don't really like to look at a resume that has a random smattering of all sorts of things from working in a farmer's field to selling vacuums. None of that really helped in the long term, but in the end, what I do now, being a high school teacher, ended up kind of being a combination of everything that I've already done. I found a job that I enjoy with a skill set that I had to work really, really hard to develop. I want my students to have the chance to imagine a future for themselves without having to think about high school being the end-all be-all of what that is. Now, as someone who has had to teach COM, while those career aptitude tests are decidedly better than what they used to be, there's still something to be said about how much life has changed from when I graduated to now, and how much life will change for them from when they graduate this year or last year or next year to when they're in a position as an adult to feel like they've finally hit their stride. The world we live in, the ways in which we interact, there are opportunities for kids now to create jobs for themselves based off of technologies that don't exist yet. There are some people, however, braver than I, that don't wait for the future, more ambitious than I, that have a vision for themselves already, and who had been working on defining their own careers and making their own paths for years now. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you please tell us your name and what you do?
Hi, Alexander. Yes, my name is Catherine Euale. I am an interdisciplinary research artist or bioartist. That is what I officially tell people. What that means in practice is that really I merge a lot of different disciplines, like from art to textiles to working with biomaterials, grown materials, meaning I work with
Mm,
actually living organisms to create different materials and art pieces, to working with electronics, to working with
mm,
digital fabrication, which means like laser cutting, 3D printing, all these kinds of things and mishmashing all of those things together. Also, audiovisual, so some film in my background as
oh.
well, and somehow making complex scientific ideas, I would say, more available to a broader audience or to a general public.
Wow, that's really cool. So my biggest question, we kind of talked about this before. I'm very personally interested in how you made this connection between art and science, because again, we've talked about this briefly before. My background is in education wise, at least, is in music and also human physiology. And the joke that came up most often from my friends is that, what are you going to do, sing the frogs? And at the time, I was like, well, obviously not. But I mean, maybe, maybe that's what I
That would
can
be
do.
amazing. I think you should have a concerto with some
Yes,
frogs. Would be a
absolutely. So how did you come to combine all of this fantastic stuff together?
Well, I would say that I was always interested in like natural things, nature, in general. I was always sort of like interested in like healthy habits and eating and yoga and like this idea of like merging with the more than human experience. Understanding life perspectives from the view of other organisms.
Oh,
However, in life, I decided to go through like the route of fashion and textiles, and this was like my introduction, I guess, into the art world and then into cinema. So I worked in film for like a decade in Toronto,
oh,
actually. And through that work, at some point, I just felt like a lack of resonance because of this sort of like permeating feeling for like I needed to be more in contact with like natural processes. And I saw
mhm,
all of the chemicals and toxins that we were using to make like really amazing costumes in the end and amazing textiles and fashion. But I was like, there's probably a better way. And then I was very interested in natural dyes that I think was like my first sort of gateway into this like mishmashing with the biological arts and with chemistry. There's a lot of chemistry behind natural dyes and like to get different colors from plants and insects
yeah,
and fungi as well. So that was like my first kind of introduction. I eventually found, sadly, I was wanting to find something in Canada that was relating to textile science, how to like create. For example, I had seen at the time, it was like maybe 2017, 2018, some people starting to work with mycelium, which is the roots of fungi. Let's call them that. That's
yeah,
not scientifically correct, but it's how we can think of them. It's like the roots of the trees, but for
yes.
mushrooms. And those were being used to create new textiles. I was like, wow, that is so cool. I wonder how I can find out about how to make this. But it was very niche, very underground at the moment. And I didn't find anything in Canada that resonated with me in that space. I
Mhm,
found a course, though, in Spain through this organization that is called the Fabrication Labs, so the Fab Labs, and there's a specific aspect of the Fab Labs that deals with textiles. So I went to study there, did like a thesis, a master's in biologically grown and biofabricated materials, but also learned like how to make wearable electronics, how to use all these fancy machines that I mentioned earlier, like 3D printers, laser cutters. I hadn't had personal experience in how to use those, and like learning any language, it gets easier and easier. So at the time, I was like, oh, what did I get into with like all of this technology? And I'm just from an arts background, like I was pulling my hair trying to make these wearable electronics, not having seen physics in like I don't know how many years, and having to go back to like what are the equations to make this LED light up. So it was a learning curve. It was challenging, but yeah, it's that is how I got into merging. It was actually, I mean, that course was really like the opening the door for me in many ways, and has shaped really like the way that I work in now, because it was so interdisciplinary. I was like, oh, I guess I don't have to pick just biology. Like, I want to work in biology and textiles, but it can also mean that I can make the machine that makes my textiles. So I can also learn
Mm,
how to make electronics and be still working in my field.
that's really
I don't know if
cool.
that made sense, but
It does. It
yeah.
makes perfect sense. No, I'm curious about how you mentioned that you hadn't seen physics for a long time and stuff like that when you took that course in Spain. How did you overcome that challenge that people often feel is there when they start looking at the sciences and they don't have that as a quote unquote background?
Oof, it's challenging. I'm not going to lie. I think I think from an artist's brain, it's a little bit simpler. And I only say that because I also work with very academic people. And I find
Mhm.
that like trying to change the way that they're like very research based. The research says this, so it should be replicable this way. It's
Yeah.
very hard to see outside of, okay, just because the research says that, why don't we replicate it with this other variable? It's like, oh no, too many variables. We can't start experimenting like that widely. But from an artistic perspective, it's actually like within creating the disaster, you normally find the breakthrough. So it was very messy. Not all of it looked good. There was a
Yeah.
lot of trials and errors. There was a lot of documentation, and I still have that discipline to today. I take a ton of pictures, videos. I make lots of notes. I keep one control in all of my experiments, and then I change like one thing in each one until I'm like, okay, this is the color that I want, or the material that I'm looking for. Or for physics, for example, for the wearables, yeah, I was also watching a lot of like kids' YouTube videos and a lot of
I
resources.
love that.
Honestly, this community is really open source. There are many spaces like Instructables, but also like open source hardware and software on like GitHub, or for 3D printing and things like this, also like Thingiverse and Sketchfab. So yeah, there's
Mhm.
a lot of places where you can start with something really simple, even Arduino if you're doing coding, which is also quite difficult in a whole other language, and it can be really scary and intimidating. There's a
Yeah.
lot of different videos and like free codes that you can even start with, as long as you have the components and start to understand with big components and big sort of prototyping on a prototyping board. You can start to see, okay, well, these connections make sense like this. This is normally the positive. This is normally the negative. And it starts to make sense, but you need to start small and have a lot of patience with yourself. And yeah, that's it. Breathe.
Yeah. I really like what you said involving the messiness. Because I remember in high school thinking that sciences was all about perfections. If you made a mistake, you erased it, and then you only kept the good copy. And I had a professor in my chemistry class in university who insisted that no erasers were allowed to enter the lab ever. And that if you made a mistake in your lab report, your lab document, you put a single line through it to acknowledge that it's a mistake, but it has to still be readable. And then from there, when we go back, we can look at the mistakes we made and things like that. How do you think the willingness to accept the messiness, has helped in your work?
Yeah, a lot of my work is very messy, and I'm not a scientist by training. Still to this day, I consider myself a citizen scientist. Like, I have
Mm,
taken many random courses here and there, and I work with tiny creatures. I work a lot with bacteria and fungi and algae. So, really, understanding that they have their own agency, and that not just because I make all the parameters and the controls will they grow in the way that I want, that they also have ways that they want to grow in, and that that is okay. Yeah, has been a way of learning that is different than uh the human progress-based way of learning. And then, yeah, just being observant, because within all those messes, that is, like I said, that is where sometimes like the breakthrough comes in, and you might think sometimes it's counterintuitive. You think you're like doing something that really doesn't make sense for the goal, the goal that you're trying to get to, or the yeah the progress. But sometimes you have to deviate a little bit if you have like a gut feeling that something else might work, just because you saw it in your observations, and go with that. And that has, in my personal experience, that has led me to some pretty big breakthroughs, just because my mentor said, no, you should stick with this and you should do that. And yeah, don't necessarily listen to everybody that thinks that they know about your work better than you do. Just yeah, take good notes and go with your gut.
I love that. Take good notes and go with your gut. Awesome. Can you, you mentioned this very briefly. Can you tell me a little bit about your mentor and where, like, what part is your mentor helping you with in this case?
Oh, I've had many mentors throughout the throughout the throughout the ages. I'm ancient. No, I'm just kidding. But my mentor from Fabric Academy, I do consider one of my like longtime mentors, although I don't really work with her one-on-one, really after school, I guess.
Mhm.
But yeah, I every now and then have like some projects that I collaborate on with her. And I consider her a mentor because also she was the one who like started the Fabric Academy course. Anastasia Pistofidou is her name.
Well,
And she's an architect. She makes all kinds of random things with biology also, and with digital fabrication. So she knows the space. And it's a good person to reference to. We're like asking about like good opportunities, who to collaborate with, because that's something else about being an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, architect, whatever it is that you consider yourself.
mhm.
It's a confusing space sometimes, because people don't understand exactly what you're doing all the time, and
Yeah.
or how to approach you, or how to approach collaborating with you. So also the work and how you word it for whether that's an exhibition, whether that is for a publication, whether that is for writing a grant. So a lot of the work is grant based normally.
Yeah, makes
Um,
sense.
you have to be very accessible, engaging, and yeah, not sound overwhelming or scary with the types of wording that you're using, because it's like involving many things at once. and and yeah, sometimes that is off-putting to some people. They just want things to be more straightforward.
Fair. Yeah, I think we live in a world right now that's so easily convenienced, and the idea that things are not working exactly how we want them to, I think limits a lot of people from doing what they're passionate about or from discovering new things. Now, with all of that said, from your perspective and all of your different experiences and different disciplines, what parts of your work do you think are the most important?
I think the research is, for me, the most important phase. It's sometimes the most frustrating phase as well, because, like I said, often things don't work out the first time, the second time, the third time. There's contamination, or like something
Mhm.
just didn't grow, or you've been trying to make charge something with like a new material, and it just like isn't working, and you can think of many different ways and alter the design and alter the materials, and it still isn't working. So that part for me is the most interesting, although can be the most frustrating as well. I think as far as the output, the most interesting part is sharing it with people and seeing like people's reactions, especially to the stories about other living creatures. It's I think because I live in the space so much, and I tend to also gravitate, like we all do, to people who are also part of this space where we're working with like tiny creatures and like
Mhm.
with electronics and this kind of like, yeah, very bio artsy vibe, that I'm like, oh, people just know about these things. But no, not everybody knows what fungi are doing in the environment. Not everybody knows that we are all descendants from algae and things like
Mhm.
this. So yeah, sometimes I think that that's like the most satisfying part and the most important part, also because it makes yeah, it makes people just have more wonder about narratives that are not just their own or their families or their communities, and to realize that our communities and our relationalities and our identities are also bacterial, like most of our body is, not even human cells. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I see in your story a lot of you forging your path. Like I imagine you looking at someone saying, "Okay, well you're done high school. Here are your options," and you saying, well, I want a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Do you have something like that?" And then you, whether through your words or your actions, saying, "No, I don't want to compromise on what I'm hoping for." And I see right now a world full of people who are feeling disconnected because they've had to make that compromise. So I'm curious from your perspective if there's any advice you'd have for people that are trying to figure out their way and where they fit moving forward from wherever they are right now.
yeah, so much. So much thought has gone into this topic for me as well. It's not like I'm always like, this is the most safe and certain way of living my life. It's
Certainly
like
not.
you need to be really comfortable with uncertainty. And especially when you're doing most of your work is like grant based, and you need to be good at a lot of things, be able to adapt. I think for me, that came out of being like a political refugee or immigrant to Canada. I'm originally from
Mm.
Venezuela, so I find this often with immigrants that we can do a lot of things. If you ask us to do this, we do, okay. If we don't know how to do it, we'll learn how to do it and do it for you. So I
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. I'm only like had that reflection more recently about myself. I'm like, maybe that's where that came from, of like trying to do all of the things and learn them well. Um, because yeah, there is no like legitimate roadmap to world building your own um perfect life or like perfect practice, let's call it that rather.
Mhm.
And it's always changing. It's never like this is the perfect practice for longevity. I always see my personal practice is always changing, and every year I have like a different depth of knowledge of what I want to do with this work and with my practice and what the message that's important at the time is. I think that's also important for artists and makers to reevaluate ourselves all the time. Is the material that we're using, does it make sense in the place where I'm living, in the time that I'm living, like in the climate that I'm living? Is it bioregional? Is it sustainable? Is it degradable? Is it so many variables that we can play with these days? There are just like, and that's just talking about sustainability in the environment. I'm not even touching on like cultural or political or any other thing that might be your field.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's always important to reevaluate, make really good connections and collaborations with people. You also don't need to know how to do every single thing and be perfect at everything. I think most of my most interesting work has been done in collaboration with other scientists or other fabrication spaces or other artists. Because other things I cannot imagine alone have been able to be produced. And I could never have done them alone because I don't have all those skills necessarily. So I think it's also important in this interdisciplinary to consider multidisciplinary, many different disciplines, many people collaborating together. Because also in nature, we see this. It's like collaboration makes evolution and not necessarily competition. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's That's my advice.
I love that though. That's awesome. Now, is there anything that you want to say just in general that you haven't had the chance to say yet today?
I think also for people that are wondering how to merge different worlds, it's important to say that it you have to like trust yourself as well. You have to trust
Mm,
yourself to take that leap into something that is not conventional, and be a good communicator of that, because yeah, of course, it's not an easy path. Often a lot of the work that I do, like I said, is grant based, or based on collaborations with other studios, or like um on pieces that commission pieces. So yeah, there's always like, it's like contract work, let's say. So unless you have
mm,
like your own studio, and even if you have your own studio and your own business in this way, it's like you still are kind of doing contract work all the time. And you have to have a good work ethic as well to like continuously keep producing different works. You also need to know when to take a break from doing work all the time,
mm,
because when you live your work also, it's like a continuous um yeah, something that has no end, and you can be just working all day all night on all these things, and also taking care of your body and your mind and your health. I think is like the most important thing for everybody to do in any situation, so that we can support other people, our communities, we can support the environment when we're thinking with clarity and with health. Yeah, and when we feel good. So, yes.
makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, I got one more question for you, and this is in general. We've talked a lot about the work that you've done, so this can live there. But I want to know, what are you curious about?
Curious. I'm curious about so many things. But I would say one thing that I'm working on, or like learning about more right now, is about DNA. And
Mhm.
that involves environmental DNA, but also fungal DNA. I've been working a lot more with mushrooms more deeply these days. And I see like these big movements happening of citizen scientists specifically. This is why I really gravitate towards the mycology field. And I see that most people working in this field have been like self-taught. So it's like a
Oh,
big movement of a
yeah.
lot of citizen scientists, a lot of people making makeshift machines and labs in their homes and things like this, and sharing the knowledge of what they're learning about growing these creatures, these mycelium, but also about foraging and identifying and cataloging new species. Because for a long time, and until more recently, really, like it's become just more popular, or there's a bigger lens on fungi these days. But for a long time, we have not been cataloging, and we actually had fungi like under plants, even like in our school systems. They were taught very briefly under like botanical teachings, and this is
Yeah.
incorrect. And we are just coming to understand that these creatures really like connect and orchestrate a lot of what is going on with our forests, and with our the bacteria in the soil, and all of the things
Mm,
that make life on this planet actually possible. So cataloging DNA from fungi is like particularly important, especially as we are increasingly sort of destroying all of the good soil microbiomes by
mhm.
tilling and pesticides and insecticides and all these other things, the plethora of things that we're doing these days that are not so healthy. So making sure that we know what is around, and what these creatures have been doing, because also DNA is like not just our genetic sort of code and footprint, but as well a catalog of history on this planet. Like a lot of that genetic code tells us what these creatures have been adapting to through time, and they have been here for so much longer than us, that we can really learn a lot about like different times on this planet of like climate stress, or of like food scarcity, or of other things that these that these organisms have lived through, and what kind of genetic adaptations they have taken on to be able to thrive better than we're doing in a lot of cases even today. So yeah, that and also that has to do similarly with environmental DNA, which is just like a bigger scope of that. It's looking at the traces of genetic material, like scales, for example, or mucus, or whatever other things, hairs from animals, creatures, can be bacteria, can be fungi, but can be like all of the diversity of living organisms on Earth, but from the environment, taking a sample from water, taking a sample from soil, taking a sample from air, and actually taking out the genetic information from all of that sample, and seeing what kinds of animals, what kinds of bacteria, what kinds of fungi are living in that tiny sample. So this is also an area that I think is really interesting. And I've done one project on this, preserving the environmental DNA from Lake Ontario. I did this in 2021, 2022, and meant for it to be used as a sort of time capsule. This was shown in a science art exhibit in Switzerland called Dear 2050, Oceans on the Rise. And I made a pendant that actually had a little vial of preserved environmental DNA sample like within it. So it would be like this amulet passed down from generation to generation with this like important genetic information till supposedly the year 2050, when this would be analyzed, and you can then compare this kind of snapshot of like, what is the population and what kinds of animals are in this aquatic life in the Great Lakes. So that's what I'm interested in at the moment.
That's really cool. Is there a place that people could see your art if they were interested, or follow your work?
Yes, they can check my Instagram. I'm not on a ton of platforms, but I have Vimeo for some of my artistic, like short art films, which normally I tend to correlate to each piece. I normally make a part that's like an audiovisual part, because I have this film background. I like the audiovisual, so I tend to have one of these pieces, but I also have some earlier documentation of some of my work there. So if people are interested in seeing and following along to how to make different bioplastics or some very simple wearable circuits, they can check my Vimeo, which I believe you can just Google Catherine Euale Vimeo and it'll pop up. I don't think there's a lot of other people with my name. I have a pretty unique last name. So if you just Google my name, you'll find
I'll put a link in the description as well.
Yes. And on my Instagram, though, I just tried to use it as like a kind of portfolio and keep all of my things there, because my website's really not updated. But I also do have a website, like a grown adult. So that is katherineuale.art.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the work that you do.
Thank you, Alex. Same. Thank you for having me. This was really nice.
Of all the years that I've taught and all the new technologies that have developed and are being used in the classroom, this year has truly been the year that AI has really settled in. The teachers can't ignore that it's a thing that we have to deal with in one form or another, and the students can't ignore that it's an option for most, if not all, of their homework at this point. At least all of their work that's not specifically designed to, again, manage AI somehow. For any students who might be listening, I need you to understand a few things about AI before you start to use it for everything. As a teacher who has only been paying attention to this for about 1.5 years, it's easy to tell when AI is being used for 2 reasons. One, if I've seen your independent work in class or previous work and suddenly you're producing far higher quality essays, lab reports, presentations, it's a little bit suspect. It does happen every so often that a student just hits their stride and all of a sudden everything is way, way better. But generally, huge unprecedented growth that never happens when you're in the classroom, only at home, is a little bit suspect. Especially if you can't even pronounce the words in your own presentation. As a side note, for those of you who have mispronounced words in your own presentation, at least look it up real quick if you're going to bust out this thesaurus. I encourage you to do that. It's a great strategy. Overall, it's like when parents have clearly done their kids' homework, with the exception that AI doesn't get offended when the work it does gets a 65% and not straight up 90s or 100. The second reason is because it's so generic. I'm talking ice cream versus frozen milk dessert levels of generic. It might do in a vacuum, but if you put them side by side, there's just no comparison. It's really easy to tell. That being said, I think students should be using AI. I do, but I think they should be using it to supplement their work rather than replace their work. I think they should use it to supplement their learning, and I think AI will become an essential part of many people's lives, school and otherwise. AI will probably take jobs. I'm not an expert, but that's just how I'm feeling. But I also think that if AI is taking jobs, it'll be ones that are predictable, routine, and repeatable, ones that don't benefit from human connection. When and where being generic is a requirement or an advantage, AI will do a fantastic job taking the load off of that. So students should be learning to use it in those ways first, at least, like spelling and sentence structure and other things that don't really change, or at least change slowly enough that it's not going to have a huge impact on them in the first couple of years. On the other hand, what we see with people using AI well already is that those folks have the independent skills necessary to treat AI like a useful tool rather than an excuse not to engage in what they're doing. When I say engaging, I mean taking an earnest, purposeful look at what you're working on. That could be school, but I'm talking about creative endeavors as well. Because engaging in our learning and our growth is how we get expansions in technology, new applications for old technology, new ideas, games, recipes, stories. All of those things are a result of engagement in one form or another. So the question that I've been thinking about since talking to Catherine is, what does it mean to engage with new technology, in this particular example, AI, in a way that doesn't discourage engagement? Catherine does amazing work, and the thing that sticks out to me the most, looking at all the things that she's worked on, is it's clear that it's something that she's connected to. There are obvious barriers to being someone who is studying mycology in a field where, like she said, most of the people are self-taught. But she's overcoming those differences. Now, I don't study mycology, which is why I'm thinking about this through the lens of AI, because that's something that is at my fingertips right now. And when I try and think of ways that I engage, I think about stories. I love stories. That's the basic concept of this podcast, I suppose. I've been thinking about AI in the same way, and for better or for worse, when I thought about AI in this way and tried to connect it to story, the first thing that came to mind for me was the ancient fantasy tricksters known as fae, or fairies. I know it's weird. Stay with me for a second. Now, for the mythology-minded folks in the crowd, I need to admit here that before making this weird connection in my head, I knew next to nothing about fairies. And if there's one thing that I have learned today, other than this weird, perhaps labored analogy, connecting it to AI, is that there's so much more that I don't know about fairies. So for the sake of my sanity and keeping this fairly narrow, relatively small scale, I am focusing mostly on fairy mythology as it relates to games like Dungeons and Dragons or books and games like The Witcher. Though there are many kinds and forms of fairies in various cultures and histories, these fairies in particular, the ones that I was thinking about, are linked with things like trickster, intentionally or accidentally deceitful, and the idea of cautionary tales where people are told and encouraged to be careful with the words that they say and the requests that they make. The other thing that I ended up looking up are some general rules for AI based on best practices, and I found a really good, fairly long but succinct, to the point guide from the Government of Canada about dealing with AI. So, in a manner that I can only describe as perhaps a quick little fever dream of mine, I've put this stuff together in a handy-dandy little list of reasons that AI reminds me of mythological fairies and why we should be cautious. Rule number 1. Always disclose when you've used AI. Best case scenario, it's only making it easier for you to do minor things you could already do yourself. It's just smoothing the path a little bit. There is a chance, though, that you're being deceived through the things it's given to you were taken from somebody else. Letting the people you're working with know that you pulled it from AI means that the odds of you accidentally taking credit for somebody else's work, stealing something without knowing it, or leading people astray are a little bit lower. Number 2, don't treat AI like an authority. It operates under different rules than we do, and the things it tells us can't always be trusted because it's not true, in all cases at least. Number 3, wording matters. AI is not great at determining your intention. If you don't show up knowing exactly what you want, don't be surprised when you get something unexpected and or unpleasant. And number 4, make sure you know who made the AI, who the AI answers to. AI programs are often owned and answer to large corporations, and therefore the results are going to be influenced by the goals of that corporation. ChatGPT is owned by OpenAI, a large company. Microsoft Copilot is owned by, Microsoft. Google AI by Google, you get the idea. Using these AI and expecting them not to direct us towards the products that their companies sell is naive at best. On top of that, there's a cost to those services. They're not free. It might not be a monetary cost, but whether they're vying for your time, your money, your personal information, there is always a cost, and it's worth making note of. Now, all we need to do is learn how to deal with the techno fairies, I suppose. At its core, though, all this silliness, there's something to be said for the way that Catherine has inspired me to think about technology. Labored analogies aside, the goal really is for me to try and connect something that I care about and love with something else that I care about and love, being stories and technology. Maybe it is me trying to live vicariously through her, or trying to reignite the old part of me that used to try and study science and music at the same time. Because, as Catherine talked about, the results of that combination is something that is truly engaging. It engages learning, passions, technologies, the idea of a future that you can mold and create to be better. It's a combination of people and ideas that requires human connection in order to exist. Catherine gives us a great example of someone making use of technology to supplement their ideas and create things that are spectacularly unique as a result. She called herself a citizen scientist, and I hope that that title is something that more people aspire to, I suppose, something that people relate to a bit more. I know even after getting a science degree, it took me a long time before I would even consider calling myself a scientist. It's like a lot of people gatekeep themselves away from getting into particular things because they don't feel like they're qualified. But in the process of learning and discovery, I don't think everything requires you to have qualifications first. Catherine is drawing inspiration from science to work with art and curiosity and compassion for the earth and creativity and building that into something new. Catherine also mentioned that most of the work that was done that she loved was in collaboration. The human part of technology and the advancement of our individual goals relies on people bringing their ideas and expertise together. So for me, my biggest takeaway is to believe in yourself and the value that you and only you can bring to a process and the learning that can happen as a result of you collaborating with other people. And that's it for this episode. Thank you again to Catherine for joining me for this. If you're interested in any of her art, her work with biology and technology, I've linked her Instagram and her Vimeo in the description of this video. Thanks to all of you for sharing in this story. My name is Alex Noel. If you liked the episode, let me know what you liked. Feel free to like and subscribe if you're feeling it, and stay tuned for more episodes. Until then, stay curious, stay connected, and thanks for crossing that bridge with me today.